Hey there, here Dr. Amanda, your host at the Neurophania Podcast, a show for hard talks where we share vision and actionable steps for a more expanded, joyful, soulful humanity. I am so glad to have you here and thank you for being part of the Neurophania mission. Hello, my beautiful Neurophaniers. Welcome to one more episode of the Neurophania Podcast. Our guest today, Dr. Therese, received her PhD from Washington University. She spent over 12 years researching quantum physics, and she has authored several books that bridges science and spirituality. She merges science, ancient wisdom, and tested techniques for harnessing consciousness. Her teachings explore the nature of our reality, human potential, and collective awakening. Welcome, Dr. Therese.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to having you. And I am really curious to know more about your work and what have you been doing in this field the past years.
Yes, so I think the way you connected through me is with my series on Gaia TV. So there's one thing I have, which is a TV series on Gaia TV, which is called Mystery Teachings.
Yeah.
And in Mystery Teachings, I really work to bridge science and where science is at today with ancient metaphysical teachings. So bridging, for example, from physics to universal Kabbalah, alchemy, Hermetic teachings, mostly Western mystery schools. So I have been personally on a journey of really finding where do science and spirituality meet? Where does this sense of us having consciousness and something beyond just the physical body, how does that match up with what we know scientifically to be true? Where do some of these ancient wisdom teachings that have been on the planet for thousands of years, how do they match up with some of today's most modern science? And finding ways to bridge the two together so they can be a very practical approach to spirituality and yet also balancing out the scientific approach with some wisdom and higher guidance. And in a way that we can really apply into our lives and really experience the transformation versus just think about these, exotic concepts. It's really about living it and embodying it in our lives. And so that ultimately led me onto a path called the Modern Mystery School, which is explores, it's an ancient lineage, an ancient tradition that brings together much of the best scientific wisdom of the past with the ancient metaphysical wisdom, because at one point in time, science and metaphysics were intertwined. And that lineage, that tradition really, I have found, has a very scientific approach to spiritual concepts and to how do we apply it in our lives to really get results within our lives, not just from a placebo effect or psychology, but real results that are sustainable, that last, that continue to empower the people who receive some of these modalities and initiations and so forth. And so I personally found a lot of growth and benefit from it. And then I ultimately became a teacher, an international instructor for the Modern Mystery School. So I also travel around the world. I teach things like universal Hermetic Great Kabbalah, alchemy. I do various initiations and really working to bridge the modern science with the ancient wisdom.
Wow, that is really compelling amount of information and seems like is a very structured way of giving this shape to this concept that most of us can see like a very abstract, but as you said, they can make sense. And I am curious about, because you just mentioned about that in the past, at some point, ancient wisdom had like some sort of science that for you made sense and connects with what we know today. Could you explore a little bit more of that?
Sure. So when I first found my way onto exploring the spiritual concepts again, so first of all, I was raised with a very open approach to spirituality, no dogma. I was encouraged to make up my own mind. to really be, it's okay to question, the religious kind of upbringing and so forth. And so I was exposed to a lot from a very early age, and just explored, and but was skeptical and very grounded and discerning, and didn't really buy into any particular one thing. But as I started to get older, I realized that that spirituality was important, and that it brought a certain sense of meaning and deeper purpose to life. And I liked that. And it then informed my outlook on life. It informed my, how can we learn from life's lessons and take a positive attitude towards it, or an attitude that helps us, gain some form of meaning, even out of hard experiences, for example, so that we can learn and grow and become the best version of ourselves that we can be. But when I got into college and then graduate school, I threw myself into science, right? So I became very, very indoctrinated as a physicist. And as a physicist, we get very much trained to be critical about things, to be skeptical, don't make claims unless you can prove it to me, and so forth. So I had this mindset of, really getting well versed into the scientific way of thinking. And yet, especially after graduate school, I went from having a life of diversity in, my early years up to about 21. And then as I got into graduate school, I was thrown into 80 hours of physics a week. And so when I got into 80 hours of physics a week, that first year, after about a year of it, I found myself feeling really dissatisfied, very out of balance. My creative side was starving. My relationships were suffering. It was like I had to put everything else aside just to survive physics graduate school. And most people who've gone into any kind of PhD program can probably relate.
Yeah, or medicine, yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of sacrifice. And so I wasn't quite sure at that point what I wanted to do with my PhD. I just knew I'm going to get a PhD so I can go as far as I can go within my academic and educational career, so that then whatever career I picked down the line, that I would never really hit that glass ceiling because I wasn't, educated enough.
Yeah.
And so I just was going for the PhD, kind of following the traditional track of what education, and academia says, this is the next step, this is what you should do. And then after my first year of graduate school with that, and it was like not at all measuring up to what I thought it would, I found myself really questioning, why am I here? What am I doing? Is it worth the expense of my sense of well-being and happiness? And so at that point I thought, okay, well, I had the balance before, and now I don't. So I just need to I thought like a scientist would, I just need to bring the pieces that I had in my life prior to this last year, I need to bring them back in, and that will bring me back to a sense of balance. So I very systematically brought back in, well, what's the key thing? Like, what's the most important thing? So I brought back in athletics and physical activity. I brought back in social time. I brought back in creative hobbies. I brought back in all these different aspects of life. And another year later, things still felt better, more balanced, but not fulfilling. Still not, like, I'm still missing some key piece of purpose and meaning and joy. And so I then realized that the one thing I had not yet brought back in purposefully was spirituality. And it had always been there in the background, but now it was the thing that I hadn't purposefully brought back in. And at that point in my career as a scientist, I was skeptical that would even be that important. And yet here it was the only thing I hadn't yet tried. So I thought, all right, let's see where this leads. And at that point, anything I was going to believe spiritually had to complement, or at least not negate, what I knew to be true scientifically. So I started searching in the science and consciousness, science and spirituality. And it was, I got really excited when I found some of the newer age books that were talking like comparing Eastern philosophy with quantum physics, for example, the Tao of physics, and some of the Fritjof Capra and Wayne Dyer stuff. And I like, it reminded me of why I went into science in the first place. It was actually a spiritual inspiration to understand the universe and how it works, and explore the bigger picture. And then, and then I got so excited by what I was experiencing that I wanted to connect with other people who I could talk with about these concepts. And so that then led me into searching for community. And then at some point, I really started finding like, okay, there's some really cool concepts here with Eastern philosophy, like Buddhism, for example, and quantum physics, but it's all very philosophical, right? It was all concepts, but there was nothing that was practical or applied. So then I also wanted practical and applied because I was an experimental scientist, and I knew that, you know, it's great if you have a concept, but that doesn't do anything if you can't apply it, test it, you know, really come up with some kind of results to verify it. And so that led me to the next level of the search.
I mean, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say that if it's real, which we believe it should be somehow tested. So.
Yeah. Well, and testing what by today's standards, testing in the past would have been different. But I am a very practical, grounded person, and I want some level of evidence, right? So I started to say to the, you know, kind of put it out there to the universe, like there's got to be a bridge, you know, there's got to be a way to ground this and bring it into practicality and some level of experimental, you know, ability to really verify if these concepts are true. And so that then led to some synchronicities happening that were continued to point me to looking into alchemy. And alchemy, to me, you know, from science history education, they say, oh, alchemy is just, you know, pseudoscience from the Middle Ages and, you know, a bunch of charlatans trying to turn lead into gold. And we all know that's not possible, you know, so it had a very bad reputation at the time for me. And this is around 2001. And so it kept coming up and it kept coming up, and people would say, oh, you need to explore alchemy. And I'd say, no, I'm a real scientist. I don't have anything to learn from the alchemists. But then it just kept coming up. And at some point I thought, all right, look, I'm going to keep an open mind. Yeah, the universe is obviously showing me this, you know, this is something important. And so I ended up having somebody gifted me a book. My mother gifted me a book, and she just really felt like, I don't know why, but you need to read this. And so I started reading it, and it was a book on the Emerald Tablets, which was the alchemical formula from, you know, the past. And as I read it, I started to realize very quickly that alchemy was not at all what we were taught in our science history classes, that it was this universal pattern or formula for how things transform and evolve. It's basically science. It was the ancient science, and it was where our original, it's the original roots of where all of our sciences today come from, whether you're talking about physics, chemistry, medicine, modern pharmacology, psychology, right? All of these sciences had their roots, their origin in the tradition of alchemy. And there was a point historically where the spiritual aspects of alchemy and the more material aspects of alchemy, the chemistry, the applied aspects, they had a split. But it wasn't a split because of any fundamental disagreement between the spiritual and the material side. It was more politically driven. It was monetary, you know, like there wasn't enough money to be made when you follow the alchemical practice because it takes a lot longer versus just the chemical approach, which you can just do mass production, for example. So there was other reasons for why there was this separation between science and spiritual. And I realized, okay, well, we've gotten to a point where science has now gone to kind of an extreme of material approach, and it's learned a lot and it's perfected its art, but it's also getting too advanced in its knowledge without the complement to the wisdom that comes from a more sort of spiritual, moral underpinning. And so I thought we need the spiritual side to come back in with its wisdom to guide our scientific applications and how we decide to use all the knowledge that we have. So I thought, well, if it originally came from alchemy, why don't we go back to alchemy?
Oh.
And so, so I realized very quickly that alchemy was applied. It could be tested. It could be, you could bring it down to earth and really live it. Both, there's the personal practice of how we transform ourselves. And then there's the applied practice, what we call practical alchemy, which is how do we make herbal remedies, for example, and more like medicine that originally came out of alchemy. There's this practical side to it where original chemistry and pharmacology originally came from anyways. So then right around the same time as I was discovering alchemy, I also discovered the Western mystery school tradition and Kabbalah and Hermetics and all of these and sacred geometry. And I just fell in love with it. And so it became my language, it really resonated for me at a very deep level.
Wow. It's impressive. And I'm just like so curious to learn, to see how really we can apply those alchemist principles in a practical way to our daily life. And I assume that is part of what your main teachings or the courses that you impart are about, right? Those are the bases.
Yeah. So a lot of the courses that I teach are more about our personal alchemy, like how do we transform and evolve and become the best version of ourselves. And yet it still follows the alchemical process. And there's 7 stages that we go through as we transform. And anything that's evolving goes through these same 7 stages. And you can even line it up, for example, and match it to the metamorphosis process of a butterfly, like a caterpillar becoming a butterfly, or anything that goes through that kind of a metamorphosis. You can see the same 7 stages. So they're very natural. It's a natural process. It's almost like evolution itself, but rather than it just being natural selection and randomness, there's a little bit more of an intent behind it. There's an ability for us as alchemists, there's an ability for us to understand that those 7 stages and actively choose to engage with them. And as we do, which is kind of what science is all about, it's all about how do we understand the laws of nature in the universe, and then how can we harness that to make things happen, or to create technology, or to make our lives easier, right? So this is the scientific approach. And so alchemy says, well, there is a natural formula for evolution, for how things change and evolve. And you can go through 7 stages, or sometimes we can get stuck in the midst of those 7 stages and backtrack and then need to go through them again. And the more that we can consciously participate with it and engage, the more that we can help speed up the evolutionary process. And so the courses that I teach are very much about our personal transformation. And then sometimes also we can get into how do we apply this, for example, in making herbal remedies. And you can definitely see opportunity for new medicine to come in where it's the medical approach, but kind of connecting back to more ancient roots again and bringing in the effect of our consciousness, the effect of our spirit, and the effect of the interconnection of the universe into that process.
Wow. I usually like for the podcast to leave the listeners with some actionable steps and practical and grounded steps. I had not found yet how I could bring that out from this conversation, but I think that since you mentioned those 7 stages, could you briefly explain what those 7 stages consist on? I don't think we could give actually like steps here because it's such a deep theme, but could you maybe make it a little bit more practical for the listeners there?
Yeah. So the basic formula for alchemy is what they call to separate and then recombine. So separate, but in the midst of that, we also purify things. So for example, you can take your whole self, right? So you as an individual have strengths and you have weaknesses. You have parts within you, gifts that have been tapped into and awakened. And then you have other things where you have blockages, where we kind of get in our own way sometimes, or there's faulty programming in our mind and we sabotage because of that. Or we limit ourselves in terms of what we think is possible for us. So in order for us to really evolve and transform, first we need to kind of pick the pieces apart. And we need to start asking ourselves what's really true, and how much of this is going to support me in my highest potential, and how much of this is going to get in the way, that it's going to become a block. And so we identify what we might call in alchemy the impurities, and those impurities are the blocks, the things that would get in the way. Whereas the essence that we want to really draw out is the gifts and the positive potential and quality. And so we would start to ask ourselves a lot of questions, like what's really true, and could there be another way, and what are my strengths, what are my weaknesses, what are the aspects of my life that really serve and support my higher potential, what doesn't serve my highest potential, what can I change to align my actions and my pattern, my daily life choices with something that's going to be more supportive of me achieving the best version of myself. So there's an example. So we start to separate and pick the pieces apart. And then when we identify, okay, this life pattern, like this behavior I have, this supports me, this is a positive quality, but then this other one that I have doesn't support me. And so I want to get rid of that. I want to discard that one. So we identify all the pieces that we want to keep, right? And then the next key is to, is there anywhere that we need to refine it? And then we want to bring them back together, and we want to create a new pattern in our life that really supports our highest potential. So that's just the most basic, but there's 7 stages, which, as you say, I mean, we could easily talk for 45 minutes just on those 7 stages. It'd actually we'd be hard pressed to get it all in 45 minutes. So I don't know how deeply you want to go into it.
Well, maybe at some other point, but I think today I still have some other questions to get like a bigger perspective picture of all this, because so can you I want to go back a little bit in a more grounded. So the people that we are in science, we perfectly know, and I think that at some point we do it with love, the sense of sacrificing a lot of joy and pleasure and things for the sake of science, career, medicine is just what it is. And at least me, you find the joy in that. You just like, it's like a sense of that. And you mentioned as well that you were going through this period, and the fact that you were introducing sport, exercise, and a different things that we have, that tools that definitely are super important to keep that level of happiness and satisfaction. But absolutely there is like I call it like the oil. It's like, yeah, you have all these things in life, relationships, sport, exercise, but for me, if you don't have this spirituality, it's like if those things don't flow together, right? And which takes me to, since you were speaking before that you spent all these years doing research in quantum physics, how do you think is the links between science and spirituality? Those, let's say, if you had to say those concepts that make sense, that you are like, oh, this makes sense.
So for me, when I first started to read about alchemy, I realized, oh, this is very practical. It's very grounded. There is an applied approach, but and yet it's informed by spiritual concepts that go beyond. It says that within everything there is this divine spark, this divine essence that a part of our role is to actively engage with how to maximize that potential. And here are the methods that we can do to accomplish that. So I really resonate with alchemy. And then I also really looked at Kabbalah. When I first started to explore Kabbalah, I was pretty astounded by when I read, for example, the Kabbalistic approach to how the universe was created.
Oh, yeah.
And then I also, at the same time, was exposed and taking classes in astrophysics and modern cosmology and how science says today the universe was created. And what astounded me was that the two of them were pretty much saying the same thing. They just had slightly different language or, ways of talking about it, but it was ultimately the same kind of concept. And I thought, wow, what else did these ancient Kabbalists know that we're just now catching up with today again in science? And so that became Kabbalah became one of my main ways to help bridge and see how all of the different pieces link together. And then how do we apply it into our lives to understand who we are and our role within the bigger scheme of things as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I have not deeply studied Kabbalah or deeply studied astrophysics, but I do have concepts of both. And when I started to read both, I was like, these are the same. How is possible that scientific has gone today to conclusions that people from Kabbalah led 1,000 years ago or hundreds years ago. So it was, for me, that was one of the waking points that, okay, this makes sense. Yeah. Like there's maybe something true here that we are still not exploring. So
yeah, there's also in the Hermetic tradition, there's a book called the Kybalion, Kybalion, mm-hmm. And it's written by three initiates of the Western mystery school tradition, and they're drawing from the Hermetic teachings, and then they talk about 7 Hermetic principles. And as you read those 7 Hermetic principles, you're like, well, this is the same thing science is talking about as well. For example, quantum physics says, there is nothing static. Like everything, when you go down to the atomic level, the subatomic level, everything is vibrating, everything is moving. It's this boiling sea of virtual, particles popping in and out of the vacuum, and everything is energy and all of this, right? But in the Hermetic principles, they have the same concept. They say everything is vibration, that there's this principle of vibration. Everything vibrates, everything moves, everything is changing. And it's the same idea as everything is energy. And, we have cause and effect, and we have all of these Hermetic principles that can be matched up very well with quantum physics. And Kabbalah and the cosmology and the creation story, can also be matched up very well with the Big Bang. And the concept of everything is one, everything is connected, can be matched up with quantum physics and their entanglement theory, and the idea that we also have a part to play in a participatory universe versus being separate from the universe.
I have just had an insight, and it's very interesting because it's interesting that you are seeing the gap between ancient and quantum physics. And you are like, oh, yes, they can unify, because for you, quantum physics is science. But I have been, and I still haven't found the answer, seeing the gap in quantum physics and medicine, because that's where I come from,
Yeah.
And imagine if there is still a gap between ancient wisdom, and between ancient wisdom and quantum physics, that this is where you are working. I still think that there is a gap between quantum physics and current medicine, which is, for me, I think is basically based on the way we interpreted the results is in mechanistic physics, not really quantum. So there may be some sort of gap of missing information there that we cannot really get to explain most of the medical, some medical situations that happen, or still cannot get to find some answers to.
Yeah. Well, I think some of that is going to rest in recognizing the role of our mind and our thoughts and our consciousness upon our biochemistry and medicine, and how that might lead to disease. And some of that is already starting to come through, for example, the study of epigenetics. And there's also a lot to be discovered through DNA, you know, that the more we get into DNA science, but not just looking at DNA as a chemical, you know, like a biomolecule, but looking at it also from an energetic perspective. How does it interact with light? How does it interact with the quantum field? That's where we're really going to start making some big headway, is then when we can start to learn to communicate with our DNA using the proper coherent energy, like LED lights or laser, you know, like low level laser light, acoustic, you know, harmonic, coherent acoustic sounds and frequency that, you know, we can use. For example, there's some ancient, not ancient, but cymatics. There's a study of cymatics where it talked about sound, the vibrations of sound having this ability to move matter. You know, so for example, if you go to a nightclub and you have a glass of water and you're standing near the bass speaker, and the bass speaker, you know, makes the water move, for example, that's the ability of sound vibration to shape and move matter. Well, there's a whole study on that called cymatics with a cymatics. And they discovered that every organ in the body has a unique sound signature, ultrasound kind of level. And you could then listen to the body and hear if it's out of tune, if it's out of harmony. And that usually meant that there was some kind of disease happening in the body. Mm-hmm. But if you then put in the proper tuning and frequency and you use sound to feed it into the body, then it will support the cells to come back to a coherent state, a harmonic state, which then supports the healing. So there's definitely an intersection that can happen between quantum physics and medicine, but we're going to have to, you know, our doctors, our medical researchers are going to have to really transform the mindset, the paradigm with which they approach medicine, from it being all about mechanics and biochemistry to recognizing there is a quantum influence, and our consciousness has an effect on all of that, and then the DNA. So yeah, the bridges are there, the links are there. It's just they're not quite being fully accepted into the mainstream mindset of our scientists.
Well, the placebo effect is undeniable and super well researched, and it's not chance. So hopefully that brings some lights. And
placebo and nocebo, right? Where they the nocebo effect, where they're convinced that they don't have it, the right one, and then they convince themselves so they stay sick. So you have both placebo and nocebo.
Yeah, well, this famous research that they receive arthroplasty in the knee. Some participants and 5 did not, and the ones that did not recover as well, or even better than the ones that received the surgery. It was so yeah.
And for certain new medicines to come onto the market, they just have to be as good or better than the placebo effect, right? So as placebo doesn't necessarily mean it's actually working. It could just be placebo. But I mean, the fact that that's a measure that is used in pharmacology today is pretty interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's used. It's one of the techniques for measuring. So that is interesting, and that's valid. It's valid. Yeah. They need to be better. And yes, also this study from the Harvard Institute that they explore the DNA changes. Can you explore it? I saw that study in your webpage. Can you explore a bit more about it?
Yeah, so HeartMath, this was done a while ago, but they were looking at the DNA and the conformation, so the twisting, the folding of the DNA under a spectroscope. And when the person that the DNA came from, when that person was exposed to or told to think about positive things, or they're exposed to pictures that were uplifting, that brought kind of a sense of joy and whatnot to them, gratitude, for example, when they were exposed to those things, they showed that the DNA actually changed its conformation and it relaxed its coil to allow for more access to the genetic potential or more expression of the genetic potential. Because from the epigenetic level, it's both where the methyl groups, which are like these on and off switches of the genes, those are part of the epigenetic layers, but also the conformation, how much the DNA is twisted and tight and balled up versus how loose and open and expanded it is. So when it's more loose and expanded, it allows for more access to the genetic code. But when it's tighter, it restricts the access. So when the people who the DNA was sample were taken from, when they were experiencing like gratitude, joy, love, positive feelings, their DNA relaxed its coil, and so clearly that's also showing that there's a connection still with the DNA within the Petri dish and the actual human that it came from. There's still this connection between them, even though it's been a sample that's been taken out. So there's a non-local connection that the DNA has with the person's consciousness. So that's one thing. And so then the DNA relaxing when they're feeling positive things, but then when they started to feel things like stress or anger or judgment or any kind of negative thoughts, the DNA would tighten up its coil and restrict the access to the DNA potential. So this is some of the research that the HeartMath Institute did to show the effects of our feelings, our mindset, and whether we're in a stressful mental state or whether we're in a coherent, what they would call a heart-based state, and the effects that has on our DNA. And of course, we also know that it has effects on our stress levels, our cortisol production, our serotonin production within the gut. Like there's this whole cascade of things that happen within the body when we're in a positive emotional state versus when we're in a negative emotional state. And then the heart rate variability. So the HeartMath Institute has also done research on what they call heart rate variability. So it's not just the heartbeat, it's the variability of the heartbeat over time. And they show that when you're in like a state of expressing gratitude or feeling thankful for the things in your life, or you're experiencing joy or love, your heart rate variability is much more coherent. It's much more rhythmic and aligned with, a nice flow. But when we're experiencing stress or, we're distracted or we have negative feelings going on, then the heart rate variability gets more chaotic. And so they're showing that the effect that the heart has on the brain, on the DNA, on the whole system. And the heart really is one of the first major organs that is fully developed and functioning within the fetus. And then it controls the whole rhythms of the brain and so forth. So there's a whole lot there that could be said about the heart. It's pretty amazing, some of the research that they're doing.
Yeah, this experiment reminds me to the double spin experiment to the electron, that when the observer, it doesn't only changes upon the observer, but also if you observe one and it changes the spin of the electron, the other automatically changes, even though they are in completely different positions in space. So maybe there's some correlations there, who knows?
Yeah, they call that entanglement, right? So the particles are entangled together. So no matter how far apart you separate them, there's still going to be instantaneous connection and communication of information between one particle and the other ones that are entangled with. And this DNA being separated from the person that the sample came from also shows a sense of entanglement between the DNA and the person. Or their consciousness, their state of being. And maybe that's because it affects the DNA within the rest of their body, and that DNA is connected. I mean, if you think about it, all the DNA in our body started from just one, egg and sperm, and those DNA coming together, and then it divides and divides and divides. So it's very similar to particles, separating and yet still being connected through the information of the quantum field. So I think there's connections there for sure.
Yeah, definitely. So you just mentioned the key part that connects, like that makes all of this possible, which is the quantum field. And I do know from Einstein, the Buddhists call it the Maya, No, the ether. They call it the ether.
Ether, yeah.
The ether. So could you tell us about what type of science or research is there behind supporting the existence of this quantum field, or how do you integrate that?
Mm. So there's still quite a bit of debate happening around quantum physics, but it is the most proven successful science theory that we have to date. Now, your cell phones, your atomic clocks, MRI machines, like all of these technologies are based on quantum physics. And so we know that there's technology that's been built based on the ideas, the theories of quantum physics. And so we have, sorry, remind me your question again. I just kind of lost
Yes,
my
a
train.
little bit. How does the quantum field theory supports by scientifically or?
Right. So the idea with quantum is that rather, like if an electron is going to go to a higher energy state, instead of it just continuously ramping up to that higher energy state, it kind of blinks out of existence and reappears in this higher energy orbit, because there's only certain allowed orbits. So it's discrete. It's rather than a continuum, it's jumps, right? Mm-hmm. It's discrete. And so in between, this orbital and that orbital, where does that particle go? Where does that electron go? It kind of like blinks out of existence and reappears in a new orbit, for example. And so they say that gap in between the allowed states, there's this gap, and that gap is the quantum realm. It's not this physical material realm that we think of. It's a non-material kind of virtual realm. And with our high energy particle accelerators, for example, they're smashing these particles together and they get all kinds of new particles just popping out of the quantum field. And I think that even when they ramp up higher and higher and higher, and they just keep smashing the particles together at higher energy, they're just going to keep discovering more and more particles because they're creating them out of the quantum field. So there's certain laws that have to be adhered to, and yet there's so many possibilities of what they could potentially discover out of the quantum field, and it's really limited by how much energy can we generate to extract that out of the quantum field. And then the other big thing that's been happening more recently within science today, that again points back to the quantum field and this what we call the 0-point energy. So 0-point energy is this idea that in a vacuum, if you put a single particle inside of a vacuum, in classical mechanics, it should have no energy. It has nothing to interact with. So it shouldn't have any energy, no kinetic energy, no potential energy, just sitting there in a ground state. And that ground state, they say, should be 0 energy in a vacuum. But quantum physics says, no, nothing is ever static. And it's always there's this uncertainty principle. So it's always got this little bit of uncertainty, like a wobble, that it does inside the vacuum. And where does the energy come from for that wobble? Well, it says that the vacuum must have a non-zero energy. And so the 0-point energy isn't actually 0. It's got some value to it. And so if you then take empty space all over the universe and you add up all that little bit of vacuum energy all over the universe, it adds up to be quite a lot. Even if you just take a cubic centimeter of empty space and you add up the potential energy of the vacuum that is stored within there, some scientists worked out those formulas, and they said it's enough energy to boil all the oceans of the world, just within one little cubic centimeter of space. So they say there's a lot of energy potential within the quantum field. And now today with modern cosmology, they say that the universe is expanding, right? So they see that there's this expansion of the universe, and not only is the universe expanding, like the bubble of the universe is, inflating bigger, they're seeing that it's, rather than it's slowing down, it's speeding up. So the universe is expanding at an accelerated rate. And they say that there has to be some kind of energy that's pushing it to accelerate, because gravity should be slowing it down. But they're seeing that it's actually being pushed to be bigger. And they say that the only potential explanation for that right now is that there is what they're calling this dark energy, right? They're calling it dark energy because they can't really directly see it. They can't directly measure it, but they can see the effects of it. And so it's this anti-gravity kind of negative pressure where it causes the inflation of the expansion of the universe to speed up. That dark energy, they're saying, might be from the 0 point energy, the vacuum energy of empty space. And so that's going back to something that Einstein actually had proposed at one point. He called the cosmological constant, that he needed to kind of make his equations for general relativity work. But he then later threw it out and said, it kind of introduced the idea of the ether again, that you see in ancient metaphysics, this idea of this etheric substance that pervades through all of space. But from a material perspective, they thought, well, it's not there because it would act like water or something like that. We should be able to see the difference in how light travels through different paths relative to the orbit of the Earth. So they're reintroducing the idea of the ether to make it kind of short. Yeah. And this is the 0 point field. This is the quantum field and the energy that comes out of empty space.
Yeah, I mean, we just have gone through like you just went from saying what happens in a small atom at electronic level to a more universal level. And similarly, we are made of atoms. So I wonder that those principles somehow applies to human body in some way that we are not yet addressing. So it's really fascinating.
Yeah, if you took your body and all the atoms of your body, and if you took away the empty space between the proton and the electrons, for example, so in that empty space is where the 0 point field, the gap, the quantum gap exists. But if you took all of that empty space away, your entire body that you think is, however big you think you are, based on size and weight and all of that, your whole body would fit on the tip of a needle. If you took away all the empty space, like if your body became like a black hole, for example, by taking away all the empty space, it would fit on the tip of a needle. So most of our body is based on empty space.
Yeah, this is the concept that this is really like empty. It's not solid. It's just that we are vibrating so low. So our physical vibration is so low here that we have the impression that this is solid, but actually any of these things are solid. They are it's vibrational. So I really wonder what happens inside of that and how our emotions, feelings, and our inner energy produces changes in that field that interacts with the particles.
Yes.
And then
that's where we need to get into learning, because the quantum field is affected by what we would call coherent energy, like a laser, so a laser can go in and affect the quantum field. X-rays could go in and affect the quantum field. Gamma rays could go, but they're laser-like, meaning they're all of a single frequency. They're all in phase with each other, in sync with each other. It's all directed in the same direction. So that kind of coherence can affect the quantum field. So for us and our consciousness to affect it, we need to be coherent. So that kind of brings us back to the heart math stuff, where it's like being gratitude, being love, that brings you into greater coherence. Learning to meditate, quieting the brain waves, bringing everything into that point of stillness brings you into coherence. That's how we can start to affect the quantum field.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for bringing that, and actually that was one of my main spiritual actions. Let's say, like, I realized you need to be coherent. Like when we say, think, feel, and express needs to be aligned, because otherwise we cannot interact with the world. And then is what happens, like we see chaos everywhere and we just don't understand what is happening. Is because we are so incoherent all the time. So it's like if our laser were going to this direction and then go to this direction, and you just manifest incoherent things in your life. So
yeah, the world is in chaos because of all of our incoherence.
that's very good.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just to finish, I just had like a last question for you that I usually like to ask. How do you feel these concepts of bridging science and spirituality can affect moving forward? Part of your teachings speaks about awakening collective. Can you elaborate a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I feel that, you know, we as a within our mindset, within our paradigm in our world today, we have come to an extreme of separation. Everybody's, you know, creating their own little separate ideology. I believe this, you believe that, we're different, therefore, you know, we have to be in conflict with each other and so forth. And so to really make that shift in collective consciousness, I feel we need to start bringing more unity rather than more separation. So rather than distinguishing this group from that group and focusing on the differences, we need to focus on where things are the same. And science and spirituality are two major drivers in our world today. You have a very scientific belief system and paradigm. We have very spiritual and religious paradigms, and they're so worlds apart right now. And yet both of them have a different side to life that they can address. And only when we can start to bring them back together and see the connections, see that where they overlap, can we then start to come to a more a paradigm that is more inclusive and holistic and brings, you know, bridges the gap, so to speak, so that we can start to find the unity again. And as they merge, they can both bring their virtues and their values to the plate and find a new synergy, rather than having to always be separate and seen as two opposing things. There is a synergy that can be established between science and spirituality. And I think that really informs us with our own personal belief systems and paradigm that we approach life and each other and the universe and the world that we live in. I think it affects everything. And just like in like 400 years ago, when, you know, Isaac Newton and the Newtonian era came out, the classical physics model became, like, these Newtonian principles became so popular that they started to inform all different aspects of life. You know, we took these ideas of determinism and rationalism and materialism and so forth, separatism. We brought all of those principles and we applied it to economics. We applied it to business. We applied it to relationship dynamics. We applied it to education. You know, we applied it across the board in our society. And we've certainly maximized that potential, but now we've gone too far and it's just creating chaos. It's like it's not serving the speed of life today, the interconnectedness of our world today, and so forth. So we need a new paradigm that's going to work with, you know, what is going to support us in moving forward so that we can move in a positive direction as a humans as collective versus self-destructive direction, which is kind of where we're at this fork in the road. And, you know, one path leads to, you know, humanity kind of self-destructing, and the other path leads to humanity making major breakthroughs that really helps us, you know, make the leap to a whole new way of life on Earth, a whole new society. Scientists call it a type 1 society, which is, you know, where we're really harnessing the energy of the planet, not relying on fossil fuels, for example, where we're creating prosperity for all rather than just creating these separations of you know, have and have not, or different, you know, poverty and, you know, versus wealth and so forth. So it's a very different approach to society because we start to realize that we live in an abundant, you know, universe. And when we start tapping into the quantum field, there is limitless possibility that we can, and limitless energy that we can tap into. So this is why I feel, but we won't be given that power of accessing the quantum field if our consciousness isn't ready to handle it and use it the right way. So I feel consciousness really needs to make that shift for us to harness the next level of science.
Yeah, absolutely. If you allow me to add, it's kind of like two separations like between a model mechanistic Newtonian where everything is correlated and that everything is just random, and that's where we have been going. But at the same time, it's interesting that we human beings, we kind of like deep inside of us know there is something else, but we just have not had enough tools to actually address it, but that is there. And somehow this system doesn't really make honor to a nature, to the nature of who we are, that deep inside we do know. And then this new system is actually emerging. Is actually the reason behind my podcast and the reason behind I am doing this, because I am convinced that we are going to this other type 1 society, and hopefully, yes, I think we are. But we need to build that. It's just not something that is going to happen if we don't do it. But definitely the energy, the information, a lot of awakened people, like consciousness, is available. So, and that integration of quantum physics, another perspective of reality, really aligns more with a real essence. And yet we don't have to miss or stop enjoying the 3D reality or whatever other aspects, because at the end of the day, we are here in the earth, in planet Earth. So we always will have this materialistic. It's just like a different approach of a different perspective. It's not that we are going to stop being human and being spiritual yogis aligned, you know?
Yeah. Very true. And we might realize that what's most important is human relationships versus material, success. And we can, if we start living in an abundant world, then the greater goals are not going to be like who has more, because there's all abundance, right? Yeah. It's going to be more like who has the higher quality of life, or who, relationship, dimension of life, or spiritual dimension. It'll be a different thing that will become the primary driver that people apply themselves towards. And that will lead to a much more fulfilling and meaningful life, because that inner fulfillment is what we need to then be seeking versus outer fulfillment.
Who can love more and better?
There we go.
Wow.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for taking the time and for being here with me. Is there something else that you would like to share, or?
I would just like to encourage people that if they want to, explore any more of what I do, or check out the mystery teaching series, they can go to my website at theresabullard.com. And there's, all the information about, mystery teachings and the mystery school, and everything that I offer is available through that website. So that would be, and then they can sign up for the newsletter and get articles and things like that.
Yes, absolutely. All that information, I will share it in our social media platform, and it's going to be available for everyone that is interested in learning more about it and get in contact with you.
Good, thank you. And then I would just encourage people to just keep that open mind and to explore, rather than just dismissing things because it's outside of the norm. The norm is changing, and we're living in a world where everything is changing, and so we need to open up our minds again and start to explore alternatives that can really help us find greater sense of balance and health and well-being and meaning in our lives. And it's really important in today's world to do that.
Absolutely, yes. As I said, the coming times, we won't be able to understand it from a rationalistic point of view. So if something resonates and feels good, go for it and see what it takes you. So thank you for saying that.
Yes, go for it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, and hopefully everyone will enjoy this.
Yep.
Strong like a tree, there's roots where I stand.
Thank you guys for making time and listening. For video version of the episode, watch and subscribe to my YouTube channel, the Neurophania Podcast. For closer interaction with myself, join us at the Neurophanics community at Patreon. In any case, see you on our next Sunday episode. As always, love for all.
Try to catch me howling at the moon.